And we're back with Kingdom Plantae, the unsung heroes of the eukaryotic world, the plants. They are, of course, made up of eukaryotic cells. They have nuclei and they have organelles. They have a cell wall that helps protect them and also provides kind of a skeleton for the plant. And the cell wall is made up of cellulose. Cellulose is made up of sugar. It's an amazing thing to think about. When you see a tree, the wood of the tree is made out of glucose. It's simply stuck together in a form that we and most animals cannot break down. They are multicellular and they're autotrophs, which means they make their own food, in this case by capturing sunlight. They capture sunlight with molecules of chlorophyll A and B. And the adults are non-motile. They don't move around. They do have gametes, though, that in some cases are flagellated and can swim, as we'll see. They come in many, many forms. Some of them are huge, things like sequoia trees. Some of them are quite small, but we have things like mosses and ferns and flowering plants, and we'll talk about each one of those groups. The Kingdom Plantae contains at least 280,000 species. There are 10 phyla, and we can break down all of the plants into 3 major groups. The first group is the non-vascular plants. Now, these are plants that don't have vasculature. Vasculature refers to tubes. Think of your own vasculature system. You have a system of tubes in your body that conduct blood. Well, here we're talking about tubes, cells that are arranged end to end that conduct either water or sugar. And these plants don't have that. Now we're going to focus on one particular group within the non-vascular plants, and I've put the groups we're going to focus on in yellow. We're going to talk about the Bryophyta, and those are the mosses. Incidentally, when you see phyta on the end of a word, I think I've mentioned that before, it tells you that you're dealing with a plant of some sort. The next group we have are plants that are vascularized. They do have specialized tissues that conduct water and sugar, but they don't have seeds. And the group we're going to focus on here are the ferns, the Pterophytes. And then finally, we have this big group, the largest group, that contains seeded vascular plants. They have specialized tissues that conduct water, specialized tissues that conduct sugar, and they also produce seeds. Some of them produce naked seeds. These are known as the gymnosperms, and within that group we have the Coniferophyta, the conifers. And then we also have what's called the Anthophyta. Antho means flower, and these are the flowering plants. Flowering plants are by far the biggest group of plants. They make up about 90% of all plant species. So where did plants come from? Well, they are closely related to green algae. We talked about them in our last topic. The earliest plant fossils date back to about 550 million years ago, and these are fossils of plant spores. Spores are very resistant structures, and even though they're microscopic, they do tend to fossilize pretty well. If we want to be specific, it's believed that plants evolved from a specific type of algae known as the Cariphesians. They're very similar to green algae, but they share some similarities with plants as well. They're kind of the missing link between the two, except that they're not missing. They're still around today. Here's a simple little cladogram, a phylogenetic tree, that shows us the relationship between the plants and a few groups that we talked about in our last topic when we talked about the Protista. We have the red algae, closely related to the chlorophytes. Those are the green algae, closely related to these cariphesians that I just introduced you to, which are closely related to the embryophytes, which is another term for the plants. Now, why would we call plants embryophytes? Well, the term literally means plants with embryos. If you've ever taken a seed, like a bean seed or a peanut, and you've split it open, you look down the bottom of it, you'll see a little tiny embryo. If you take a really close look at one of those seeds, you'll see a little structure that looks like a root and little structures that look like little leaves contained within the seed. So seed plants do actually have tiny little embryos in their seeds. Now, how did plants evolve? Well, like all other major groups of organisms, they started out aquatic. They started out in the water. And as plants moved further and further away from the water, they evolved new specializations, new structures that prevented their cells from drying out and allowed them to reproduce without the use of water. The adaptations that we see in plants today are all related to this movement away from water and a decreased dependency on water for reproduction. So here we're seeing again a phylogenetic tree here, and you can see about 550 million years ago we had the origin of land plants from these cariphesians. Now cariphesians are still around today. They are multicellular organisms that are kind of plant-like and kind of algae-like. They're kind of in between. They are remnants of that transition. And we find them in fresh water. We find them in ponds and lakes and so on. But they ultimately gave rise to the bryophytes, which are the mosses, and their allies. And then the bryophytes gave rise to the pteridophytes, which are ferns and their close cousins. And then they gave rise to the gymnosperms, which includes the conifers, which then gave rise to the angiosperms. And of course, we still have all of these groups around today. Happily, unlike the protista, plants are monophyletic. So remember, the protista includes a lot of very diverse groups that aren't necessarily closely related. They've all just been thrown together because we don't know what to do with them. But plants are monophyletic. We can trace them back to one ancestor. So I've tried to show this with my somewhat lacking artistic skills. We've got a cariphesian there growing on the water's edge, giving rise to bryophytes, which are still very, very restricted in where they can grow. They need a lot of moisture, and they do need moisture for reproduction. And then we have the pteridophytes, the ferns. They're a bit less dependent on water. And then, of course, the conifers, members of the gymnosperms, and finally the angiosperms. But we have this progression. We have this change where the organisms became less and less dependent on water. Let's have a look at the characteristics or characters that all plants possess. All plants are multicellular, and they all have what are called apical meristems. A meristem is a location that contains stem cells. Stem cells are cells that are constantly dividing and giving rise to several different types of cells. For instance, in humans, we have stem cells in our bone marrow that give rise to all our different types of blood cells. But in any case, the apical meristems are responsible for something called primary growth. That is the lengthening of the plant. So we have meristems at the top of the plants, in the shoots that give rise to new branches. We have meristems in the roots, down at the root tips that give rise to new roots. They have embryos. They have multicellular embryos that are dependent on the parent plant. Just like an animal embryo is dependent on its mother, plants have these embryos that they have to nourish and take care of. All plants have an alternation of generations, and that's where we have one generation that's haploid, followed by a generation that's diploid. And the haploid generation is responsible for making gametes. We'll talk about that in a lot more detail. They have what are called sporangia. These are structures that produce spores. We find these on the diploid individuals, and the spores are very tough-walled and resistant. They also have gametangia. These are structures that produce gametes, and these are found on the haploid individuals. But the gametangia and the sporangia are multicellular structures. Let's have a look at each of these defining characteristics in a bit more detail. We'll start with apical meristems. Apical meristems are responsible for primary growth. That's the lengthening of the plant. So think of a tree. The tree gets taller because of shoot apical meristems, and the roots get longer and deeper because of root apical meristems. So in the first figure there, what we're seeing is a cross-section of a plant under a microscope. And you see these really dark areas here, and here, and here. Now these are areas that contain stem cells that are dividing very rapidly by mitosis. As those cells move up from that area, they start to differentiate into xylem cells and phloem cells and parenchyma cells and other cell types that we see in plants. On the next diagram, we're seeing a root apical meristem, and you might have looked at something like this in the lab if you were looking at cells that were dividing by mitosis, because there's a lot of them in this area. That is the root apical meristem, and once again we have rapidly dividing stem cells that, as they move away from this area, differentiate into the different cell types. But the take-home message here is that the apical meristems are going to lead to a lengthening of the plant, and that's known as primary growth. A lot of fleshy plants, like house plants for instance, will get longer, so they'll grow in height, but the stems don't necessarily get all that much thicker. However, some plants undergo what's called secondary growth, in addition to primary growth. Secondary growth is where the stem widens and we have the deposition of wood. So we produce these woody, tough stems. This is the product of a layer of tissue known as the vascular cambium. And if you look at the diagram on the left, you're seeing a section through a rather young tree trunk. This is the vascular cambium here, that green tissue. And what happens here is we have cells that are dividing by mitosis, and they're dividing so that some cells move inward and some cells move outwards. The cells that move inward become xylem cells. These are very tough cells. They have a very tough cell wall, and they conduct water. They eventually die as they move inward, and they give rise to wood. The cells that move towards the outside of the stem develop into phloem cells, and these are the cells that conduct sugar. If we tap a maple tree in the spring to get sap, we're tapping into those phloem cells. And if you've ever peeled bark off of a tree and you see a green slippery layer, well, that's the phloem and the vascular cambium. Outside of the vascular cambium, there may be another layer known as the cork cambium that actually gives rise to the bark. Looking at the figure on the right, we're seeing a section under high magnification through a microscope, a cross section this time, and the line that I'm drawing here represents the location of that cambium. We have cells that are dividing here. They're dividing and splitting. Cells are moving outwards, and they're becoming phloem cells. And cells are moving inwards, and they're becoming xylem cells that will eventually give rise to wood. If you think back to our last topic, I mentioned that fungi have a multicellular haploid stage. And the diploid stage consists only of the zygote, and it's very short-lived, and it's a single cell. Whereas the animals are the opposite. They have a multicellular diploid stage, and the haploid stage consists only of the gametes, and it's very short-lived. The plants are weird because they have a multicellular diploid stage, and they have a multicellular haploid stage. The multicellular stages in any life cycle are referred to as generations. So they have an alternation of generations. They alternate between a multicellular diploid stage and a multicellular haploid stage. The multicellular diploid stage is known as the sporophyte. Again, phyte means plant. It's a plant that makes spores. The multicellular haploid stage is known as a gametophyte. It's a little tiny plant that makes gametes. So let's take a look at how this works. We'll start with the sporophyte. Again, it's multicellular and it's diploid. Now, it doesn't make gametes directly, like animals such as ourselves would. Instead, it undergoes meiosis and it produces haploid spores. The haploid spores land somewhere appropriate. They find a nice moist bit of soil, and those haploid spores undergo mitosis, and they become a multicellular haploid individual, the gametophyte. Now, this is where things are a bit weird. Remember that mitosis can occur in a cell of any ploidy. There are specialized structures called gametangia within the gametophyte that produce gametes by mitosis. So the gametophyte is haploid. Mitosis in that individual will produce haploid cells, gametes, that then come together and produce our diploid zygote. It undergoes mitosis, and we're back to the sporophyte. The same process is seen in the Caraphesians, which again are thought to be the direct ancestors of the plants. We have a multicellular haploid individual, and it produces sperm and egg by mitosis. The egg, though, is retained by the parent. The sperm from another individual fertilizes it and creates a zygote that is still retained by the parent. It undergoes several rounds of mitosis before it eventually undergoes meiosis. And this is exactly what we see in the most primitive of the plants. Plants also have dependent embryos. And what I mean by that is the embryos are retained by the parents, or at least they're retained within a seed-like structure. So they feed off of parental tissues for a little while. What you're seeing on the right here is really quite interesting. So here we have a seed-like structure, and we have an embryo right here. This structure right here. So up the top here, we have two leaves that are developing. Those kind of Mickey Mouse-like ears are actually leaves of our embryo. And then down the bottom here, we have a root that's forming. So we have apical meristems already. We have an apical meristem at the top of this little embryo, up in here. And we have an apical meristem down here, a root apical meristem that will give rise to the root. So there's a little embryonic plant there, a little baby plant. It's all ready to go. And what's really quite fascinating about this particular species is this structure here, I'm showing in yellow, is basically an umbilical cord. It's got a chain of cells known as an umbilicus that roots it into a structure known as the placenta. And the placenta is providing nourishment from the parent plant. Now, not all plants have this arrangement of tissues, but they all have a similar process that they go through where they nourish their offspring. The diploid multicellular stages of the plant life cycle produce spores, and the spores have a very tough wall around them that contains a protein known as sporopollenin. Don't worry about that, but just realize that this is a really, really tough protein. Spores can be resistant. They can lie dormant for decades or longer. What you're seeing on the bottom left here, we've got a section through something called Lycopodium, which is a plant that grows on the forest floor. You might have seen it before, but we have these structures here called sporangia that are producing spores. You can see those spores in the middle bottom diagram. Down the bottom here on the left, we can see a spore that's produced by a fern. And if you've ever had a good look at a fern, if you turn over the frond, the leaf of the fern, and take a look underneath, you might see it shedding some of these spores. Within the haploid gametophytes, so the multicellular haploid stage of the plant, we have structures known as gametangia. These produce gametes. And we have two types. We do have sexes in the plants. We have male and female structures. The Antheridia produce sperm, and the Archegonia produce eggs. And what you're seeing here, we've got a few different structures from hornworts, which are kind of small plants that grow on the forest floor. They look kind of like mosses. And then next to that on the right, you have the structures from moss plants. We'll spend a bit more time talking about them, but at the top here we have these structures that are filled up with sperm cells. And in moss, there are actually sperm cells with flagella that swim around in the water. And then down below that, you have these structures called Archegonia that contain egg cells. And you can see an egg cell here, and you can see another one over here. And those egg cells will be fertilized by the sperm. Terrestrial plants also have to be adapted for living on dry land, so they need to conserve water. And in many of them, especially the vascular plants, we see lots of structures that are dedicated just to this. So some plants will have a waxy cuticle. This is a layer of wax outside of the epidermis, and that helps to trap water in the plant. Vascular plants will have stomata. Stomata are openings, usually on the underside of the leaves, that allow atmospheric gas in and out. So of course, a plant is photosynthetic. It needs to take in carbon dioxide and it needs to get rid of excess oxygen. And that happens through these little holes that can be opened or closed. So if things get too hot and there's a chance that the plant is going to lose lots of water vapor, then these little holes can be shut. Let's take a look at our first group of land plants. These were the first land plants to appear, so we might say they're the most primitive, and they're found all across the planet. I'm sure you've seen them before. These are the mosses. They're properly known as the bryophytes, but we'll stick with the common name. So no doubt you've seen something like this growing on the forest floor or growing on a rotten log. What you might be surprised to learn is that these little tiny plants are actually haploid. They're gametophytes. There are other members in this group which you're probably less familiar with. So we have, for instance, the hornworts and the liverworts. We're not going to talk too much about them, but they are quite fascinating little plants. We're going to focus on just the mosses. In this group, the gametophytes are the dominant generation. What I mean by that is they're the biggest individuals and they make up most of the life cycle. And mosses do not have conductive tissue. They don't have xylem to conduct water. They don't have phloem to conduct sugar. And the reason for that is they're quite small and they don't have to conduct these things very far. If you've paid close attention to moss, you might notice that sometimes in the year there are these brown structures coming out of that leafy green bit. Those brown structures are sporophytes. They're diploid. And the very top bit there, the kind of bulbous bit, is known as a sporangium, and it produces spores. So the green bit is photosynthetic, and the part that's sticking up that's brown, it is not. It's the sporophyte, and it is only produced to release spores. Okay, let's have a quick look at the moss life cycle. So again, those little green plants that you see, they're gametophytes. They're haploid. And for most mosses, there are two separate sexes. We have male gametophytes and we have female gametophytes. Some mosses, though, are hermaphrodites. That means on one plant, one of those little sprigs, we have both male and female reproductive structures. Now, moss are highly reliant on water for reproduction, and that's why you always find them in damp places. When it rains, there quite often will be droplets of water on top of the moss gametophytes, and that's where their reproductive structures are. And what happens is the male structures, the antheridia, release sperm, and they have flagella and they swim through that droplet of rainwater, and they find a female structure, usually on another gametophyte. But again, if we're dealing with something that's a hermaphrodite, it could be on the same little plant. Anyway, the sperm is going to swim down through this female structure, find the egg, and fertilize it. And then we get a diploid zygote. The zygote undergoes mitosis and develops into an embryo. The embryo develops into a multicellular diploid sporophyte. But what's really interesting is the sporophyte is not released, it grows out of the gametophyte. The sporophyte is not photosynthetic, so the gametophyte has to feed it. It's almost like a parasitic little plant. Inside the top of that sporophyte, within structures called sporangia, meiosis occurs, and that produces haploid spores. The haploid spores are released into the air, they settle out somewhere damp, and they grow into new gametophytes. Incidentally, the sperm and the egg are made by mitosis. We start with haploid cells in the gametophyte, and they produce those haploid gametes. So just looking at that again, The green, again, is the gametophyte, and you're seeing one isolated down there in the bottom left. And then if we look at the top, the part that is likely to be covered with a drop of rainwater after a rainfall, we have structures called Antheridia. They produce sperm, and we have structures called Archegonia, and they produce eggs. And you can see a nice example of an egg right here in this one. Now, I don't expect you to know those two names, Antheridia and Archegonia. Just realize, though, there are separate structures that produce sperm or egg, and they do that by mitosis. And here's a closer look at some sporophytes from some different species of moss. Again, the sporophyte is diploid. Inside this structure, the sporangium, the spore-producing structure, we have meiosis. So haploid cells are produced from diploid cells. Remember, each diploid cell that undergoes meiosis produces 4 haploid spores. When they're fully mature, there's a little cap here that will pop off, and then those spores are released into the wind. And you're seeing that on the right here. There's a cross section through one of these things, and you're seeing little spores being released out into the world, and they will develop into new gametophytes. And here we're seeing spores germinating. So the spore will give rise to a chain of haploid cells that grows through the soil or through that rotten wood. Almost looks a little bit like the hyphae of a fungus. But eventually, they will start to give rise to new multicellular gametophytes, and you can see one forming right here. And here's a cute little baby gametophyte on the left. So you can see it's starting to get its leaves. It is photosynthetic. It's going to grow up above ground, and it's going to be responsible for photosynthesis. To summarize with the full life cycle again, we have the haploid gametophytes in the top left. Top middle, that would be Archegonia containing egg cells. They're at the top of the gametophyte. They're going to be fertilized by sperm. And then top right, we have the sporophytes, the diploid plants that grow out of the top. At the top of the sporophyte, we have a sporangium, and you're seeing that in the lower left. There's a little cap that opens, and the spores are flicked out into the wind. You're seeing the spores in the middle bottom there. And finally, the last picture, bottom right, we're seeing the spores that have germinated into a strand of cells. And then from that, we'll get new gametophytes popping up through the soil. Continuing with our survey of plants, we're going to look at the ferns next. Now I'm looking at the plants in the order that they appeared. So we had the bryophytes first, followed by the pteridophytes, the ferns. Again, we're going to stick with the common name here. Ferns have some new adaptations that make them a little less dependent on water. And also the sporophyte is the dominant part of the life cycle. It's also much larger than the gametophyte. Ferns are also vascular plants. That means they have specialized tissue that conducts water and sugar. So before we continue on and look at the fern life cycle, let's just talk about what it means to be a vascular plant. We have 3 big groups that are vascular plants. We have the ferns, the pteridophytes. We have the gymnosperms, things like conifers, and then we have the angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. In all of these, we have some highly specialized tissues, including xylem, which is used to conduct water, and phloem, which is used to conduct sugar and nutrients. Also, in all vascular plants, the sporophyte generation is the dominant generation. The vascular plants that don't make seeds are grouped into what's known as the pteridophyta. And it includes a whole bunch of quite different organisms that probably maybe shouldn't be together. It might be a polyphyletic group. But anyway, I'll talk about a few of the members just out of interest. I'd love to talk more, but it's beyond this course. We have a group called the lycophytes that include the club mosses, the spike mosses, the quillworts. You might have seen them before. Some of them are pretty common. We're not going to talk about those though. And then we have the pterophytes, and that includes the ferns. The only group I want you to know something about, the whisk ferns and the horsetails. Whisk ferns are really odd looking. It was once a really successful group back in the age of the dinosaurs. There's not many of them now in terms of species, but you do quite often see them in flower arrangements. So you might see them in a vase with some other stuff. And they look like green sticks with little yellow blobs at the end. The little yellow blobs contain the sporangia that make the spores. The last one there is Equisetum, or horsetail. It's a really common weed. You'll see it growing along the side of the road. It grows in one of two forms. So most of the year it'll have these green structures. They almost look like tiny little evergreen trees. And that's the photosynthetic form. And it also grows like this sometimes. That's the reproductive form. Those cone-shaped structures at the top are actually producing spores. In the ferns, the sporophyte, so the diploid individual, is the dominant part of the life cycle. It's also much larger. Some ferns can be quite large. And in fact, in dinosaur times, there were tree-sized ferns. The sporophyte is larger and more complex than anything we saw with the mosses. The gametophyte is really small. You probably miss it if you're out walking in the forest, unless you get down on your hands and knees with a magnifying glass. And the gametophyte doesn't last very long. Now, they produce one type of spore. The mosses do this as well. So we say they're homospores. Homo means the same. Now, we'll see that in the angiosperms, the flowering plants, and the gymnosperms, the conifers, etc., we have spores that are different sizes. So I will come back to that. Quite often, the gametophyte is hermaphroditic, and that means it's both male and female. So let's take a look at the life cycle here. We'll start down in the lower left. We have a fern. I'm sure you've seen a fern before. And on the underside of the fern frond, the leaves, there are structures known as sporangia that produce spores. So the entire fern is diploid, but there's cells in the sporangia that undergo meiosis and produce haploid spores. The spores are spread by the wind. They settle out on some damp soil somewhere, and they grow by mitosis into a multicellular haploid individual. And that's known as a gametophyte. Interestingly, the gametophyte is usually heart-shaped, and it's usually only about 1 centimeter or so in size. So you would literally have to get down on your hands and knees with a magnifying glass and kind of pick through the dirt to find these things. When it rains and the soil is very, very wet, these gametophytes release gametes. And they don't do it at the same time. So the male structures and the female structures mature at a different rate so that a gametophyte is not simply fertilizing itself. But we'll have one gametophyte that will release sperm, and the sperm are really weird. They're kind of corkscrew shaped, they're covered in flagella, and they swim through the water of the soil, and they'll look for an egg on the female structure of another gametophyte. They fertilize it, it becomes a zygote. The zygote develops by mitosis, remember the zygote is diploid, into our new sporophyte. The sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte. The gametophyte helps to nourish it and helps to house it for a little while, but the sporophyte will eventually grow out of the gametophyte, grow out of the soil, and absorb the gametophyte. Let's have a closer look at that life cycle. So I'm sure you all know what a fern looks like. It has these leafy fronds that are for photosynthesis, of course. On the top right there, you're seeing something called a fiddlehead. This is how those fronds grow. So they're all curled up like the head of a fiddle, and they unravel as they grow. You can find these in late spring, early summer, where we are. As soon as the snow is gone, have a look for these. They're quite tasty. Fry them up in some butter. And underneath the fiddleheads, we have the underside of one of these mature fronds. And you're seeing lots of brown structures there that contain the sporangia that make the spores. Here's a closer look at the underside of those fern fronds. And we can see these structures called sori. Don't worry about that name, but that's what each of those circular structures is called. And if we zoom in closer, we'll see little tiny ball-like structures that are the sporangia that contain the spores. So here we see those sori again, these round structures. And if we take a closer look under a microscope, they look something like this. You can see there's kind of this umbrella-shaped structure, and then there's these sporangia poking out from underneath it. And here's a closer look at that. We've taken a section right through the middle of one of these sori, and we're going to zoom in on just one sporangium. So for instance, this structure here, that's the sporangium. In the middle is where meiosis is occurring to produce spores, and those red structures in the middle are spores. So here we've got a nice view of that. We've got spores developing. This is one sporangium here, and this is going to dry out, and when it does, it's going to split, and it's going to eject those spores into the air. Ferns have a rather interesting way of ensuring that their spores are released at the right time. If you're a fern, you don't want to release spores when it's really wet out, when it's raining, for instance, because what will happen is the spores will just get trapped in the water. You want them to spread as far as possible. So the sporangia have, as you can see here, one part that's lined with very, very thick, heavy cells. Those cells tend to shrink quite a lot as they dry out. On the other end of the sporangium, we have these very delicate lip cells. So the cells of that heavy part, called the annulus, are going to dry out, they're going to shrink, and that's going to cause the front of the sporangium to split open, and basically these spores are going to be barfed out into the wind. The spores will eventually land somewhere appropriate, some moist soil, and they'll germinate, and they will grow into a multicellular haploid gametophyte. And I have to say, I think the gametophyte might just be the most romantic thing on the planet. First of all, it's shaped like a heart. Secondly, it's a hermaphrodite. It produces both male and female gametes. So towards the center of the heart there, we have these structures called archegonia. They contain eggs. And down the bottom here, we have structures called antheridia, and they produce sperm. And the sperm are going to be released into the soil water and swim to another gametophyte and fertilize the eggs that it has. And we end up with this. The diagram on the left shows a gametophyte, it's labeled B, that has given rise to a new sporophyte. It's labeled A. The sporophyte grew out of the gametophyte and it draws nutrients from it until it can take care of itself. And then the gametophyte breaks down. So again, that's one characteristic of plants. They do take care of their next generation. they have these little embryos. So there was a little embryonic sporophyte that formed within the female structure of the gametophyte, and the gametophyte nourished it for a little while, but it's growing out of it and it's absorbing that gametophyte. The mosses and the ferns are both seedless plants. And what I mean by that is they don't make seeds. So they make spores, and the spores help disperse the plants. But remember, the spores develop into gametophytes. Flowering plants and the gymnosperms have seeds, like the kind of seeds we might eat. Now, those seeds contain an embryonic sporophyte. Again, that's not the kind of thing we see in the mosses and the ferns. The very first seed plants appeared about 350 million years ago. But they didn't really start to diversify and really take off until Pangaea was a thing. Remember, Pangaea consisted of all of the continents all pushed together into one big supercontinent. Now, as you can imagine, the interior of this continent was quite dry. It's a long way from the nearest ocean. There wasn't that much moisture making it to the interior of this continent. There was lots of land available, lots of real estate that these new plants could colonize, but in order to do so, they needed to be very well adapted to dry conditions. A lot of the specializations that we see in the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, the seed plants, are related to conserving water and being less reliant on water. So remember that in the mosses and the ferns, they are very reliant on water for reproduction. The sperm has to physically swim through water to fertilize the egg. The gymnosperms and the angiosperms got rid of that dependency. The development of the seed was also an adaptation to dry conditions. It allowed the sporophyte to survive for extended periods of dryness as an embryo. Seeds can sometimes survive decades before they germinate. Anyway, we'll talk about how the seeds are made in just a moment, but let's talk about how the spores are made, because we still do have spores. In the gymnosperms and in the angiosperms, we have two types of spores. We have little tiny spores, and they're called microspores. Makes sense. And then we have big spores, and they're known as megaspores. Also makes sense. The microspores develop into a male gametophyte, and the megaspores develop into a female gametophyte. Now, I've mentioned this before. The biological difference between male and female relates to the number and the size of gametes that are produced. In the case of plants, it also relates to the number and size of the spores produced. And that'll make sense, hopefully, in a moment. The microspores develop into a tiny gametophyte that's known as a pollen grain. So the pollen that's released by pine trees and by flowers is actually a little tiny haploid plant. And it's really tiny. It consists of only 3 cells. That's the male gametophyte. Now, pollen, which is the male gametophyte, has to be transferred to a female structure. And generally, the female structure stays put on the female parts of the plant, and the female gametophyte forms something known as an ovule. The pollen is transferred to the ovule, and that's known as pollination. Lots of ways that could happen. Sometimes it's carried by water, so the pollen can be transmitted by water in water plants, or through the air, like what happens with a pine tree, or of course by a pollinator, like a bee if we're talking about a flowering plant, but we'll get to that. The pollen grain, which contains the male gametophyte, produces a tube that transfers sperm cells to the female gametophyte. Now, in the case of some gymnosperms, the sperm are dumped into a tiny drop of water that is just found on the surface of the female gametophyte, and they actually swim a tiny distance. I'm talking a small fraction of a millimeter. But in most seed plants and all angiosperms, there is no flagellum, and the sperm cells are carried directly by this pollen tube all the way to the egg of the female gametophyte. The airborne pollen allowed for greater spreading of the megaspores, and sorry, not the megaspores, the microspores, and allowed plants to spread and colonize lots of new environments. So down the bottom there, you can see there's a structure known as a megasporangium. We're not going to worry too much about that, but that's the female sporangium that makes the big female spores. The spores aren't released. Instead, they're held onto, and they develop into a female gametophyte that contains eggs. So egg cells. And then, of course, the pollen grain is transferred to the female gametophyte. It has a little opening. You can see the micropyle there. And the pollen grain extends this pollen tube, and that carries the sperm cell to the egg. We get fertilization. That's where the egg and the sperm meet, and we get an embryonic sporophyte living inside this structure that was made by the female parts of the plant. That structure was known as the ovule, but once it's fertilized, we start referring to it as a seed. Gymnosperms have naked seeds, whereas angiosperms produce fruits. So gymno means naked. Think of gymnastics. It was invented by the Greeks, and they used to do it in the nude. Sperm means seed. So naked seed. Angio means vessel. So the seed is in a vessel of some sort. So in angiosperms, the flowering plant, there's usually something edible, not always, but usually something edible packed around the seeds, and something will eat that and then take in the seeds, defecate somewhere, and help spread seeds that way. I'm going to continue introducing groups in the order that they appeared, and the gymnosperms appeared before the angiosperms. There are lots of groups in this phylum that I'd like to talk about, but we're just going to focus on the conifers. Before we do, though, I'll just make you aware of some of these groups. You might have heard of some of them before, but I'm not expecting you to know them. We've got the Ginkgophyta. This was once a large group of gymnosperms, and the members were quite common. Back in the time of the dinosaurs, there would have been forests of Ginkgophyta, but today we have one species left, Ginkgo biloba. You might have heard of it. Some people think it has some health benefits, but that's the only remaining species from this group. Then we have the cycads, the Cycadophyta. You've probably seen these before. They look a bit like ferns or maybe like a palm plant, but they're not. They produce naked seeds. Then we have the Cnidophyta, which is a really weird group. They live in usually desert areas, or at least areas that are very dry. They're slow growing, and some of them can be really old. The one on the top there, it doesn't look like much. It's this desert plant with these kind of shredded strap-like leaves, and it can live for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Underneath that, we have something called ephedra. You might have heard of that before. This is a plant that contains a compound that's found in cold medicines, also used to make ecstasy and crystal meth. Anyway, then we have the Coniferophyta, the conifers. Very large group, lots of members, and I'm sure you're very familiar with. Things like spruce and fir and sequoias, etc. So the largest group, they have cones, and the cones consist of clusters of scales. And what's interesting is those scales are actually modified leaves. The modified leaves are known as sporophylls. We're not going to worry about that really, but just realize that the cones are actually made up of these dried out, really tough modified leaves. Most are evergreens. That means that they hang on to their needles year round. Not all, of course. We have larches, for instance, in our area that shed their needles. The conifers have two types of cones. So we have what are called staminate cones, and they're male, they produce pollen. And then we have what are called ovulate cones, and they produce female gametophytes that contain the egg. So these are female structures. And generally we have both male and female structures on the same tree. Here's a look at one of those male cones. So we have these scale structures, and attached to each one of them is a sac. And you're seeing one of those sacs marked with an X. And that's where meiosis occurs, in these sacs, and those sacs fill up with pollen grains. And you're seeing a pollen grain down the bottom right there. Kind of looks like Mickey Mouse, but what it is a tiny male gametophyte. And those ear-like structures are actually these really light kind of air bladders that help them float through the air. Conifers, at least most of them, use the wind to disperse the pollen instead of pollinators. Let's have a look at the first part of the gymnosperm life cycle. So again, we have two types of cones. We're going to focus in on the male cones, the staminate cones. And again, within the cones, we have these sacs. That's where meiosis occurs. And meiosis is going to produce haploid cells that develop into little haploid male gametophytes. Those are the pollen grains. And the pollen grains contain sperm cells. The pollen grains are released into the wind, and maybe, if they're lucky, they will just happen to land on a female structure. So the ovulate cones, they contain structures called ovules. There's two of them for each one of the scales in a cone. There's a little opening that allows the pollen grain to come into contact with the female gametophyte, which is found in these ovules. And once that happens, the sperm from the pollen grains will find their way to an egg cell inside the ovule. Now let's have a look at what happens in the female cones, the ovulate cones. They take a while to develop, usually more than 2 years, and you can see that they can be quite big. This is where seeds are made. So we have these highly modified leaves that have turned very woody, and they're the scales. And then attached to the scales, we have structures called ovules. Inside these structures is where the female gametophyte will be produced. So we have megaspores, female spores, that develop into female gametophytes, but the spores weren't shed, and the gametophytes aren't shed, and instead the archegonia within the gametophytes will be fertilized. Once that happens, that ovule becomes a seed. Here we have a section of a developing female cone. In the bottom right, we're zoomed in, and that X marks the location of an ovule. So that structure that you're seeing right here is an ovule, and it contains a female gametophyte. And then the structure attached to that out here, that's going to become a wing-like structure. So you might have noticed when you look at pine seeds, for instance, they have this thin wing attached to them, and that makes them twirl through the air, and that helps disperse the seeds. Let's continue looking at the life cycle, this time focusing on the female structures. Within each ovule, we have a diploid cell that undergoes meiosis, and that will produce 4 haploid spores. Now, 3 of those spores disintegrate, but 1 survives, and it becomes a female gametophyte. Inside that female gametophyte, we have an archegonium, and we have an egg inside that archegonium. Remember that the pollen is carried by the air, and it lands on the ovule. There's a little opening in the ovule. That's the site that it lands at. That contact between the pollen grain and the ovule is referred to as pollination. Now that's different from fertilization. Fertilization is when the egg is actually combined with the sperm. So we have pollination, but then remember the sperm have to be carried by a pollen tube to the egg sitting in the archegonium, and then we get a zygote. The zygote is going to develop into the next sporophyte. And once fertilization has occurred, we stop referring to this as an ovule, and then we call it a seed. Here's a section through a seed. In the middle, we have our sporophyte embryo. It's a little tiny plant. And it really is a little tiny plant because there is a root apical meristem down here, and there is a shoot apical meristem up here. So this is a little baby plant all ready to start growing. And then surrounding that is what's left of the gametophyte. The female gametophytes in the gymnosperms contain lots and lots of cells, but most of those cells are going to end up surrounding the sporophyte embryo as food. So this is the food source that has been packed away to help feed that little plant as it starts growing before it can photosynthesize on its own. So to finish off, that little embryo that forms from the zygote through mitosis is going to be contained within this very hard-walled seed that will protect it. And seeds can stay dormant for quite a long time. Seeds can also have little wings or fluff or something on them that helps them be dispersed great distances. When the seed lands somewhere suitable, then the seed is going to germinate, and that little tiny embryo is going to feed on haploid cells that were once part of the female gametophyte until it can open up some leaves and start photosynthesizing. We have one last group of plants to talk about, and those are the angiosperms, the flowering plants. They get their name from the fact that they make fruit, and they're the most diverse group of plants and the largest group. There's at least 250,000 species, and it's thought that right now they make up about 90% of the species of plants on the planet. They have a more complex xylem structure than we saw in the gymnosperms just a moment ago. And we won't get into this in detail, and I don't expect you to know these 3 types, but we have what are called tracheids, which conduct through little valves that can be opened and closed. We have vessel elements, which are like hollow drinking straws connected to end. And the tracheids and the vessel elements are used to conduct water. So they can conduct water all the way from the roots right up to the treetops. And then we also have what are called fiber cells. They're not used to conduct water, they're used for support. When we make paper, we're extracting these cells and making the paper just out of these cells. We have two main groups of angiosperms. We have the monocots and we have the dicots. There are structures known as cotyledons in the seed, as we'll see, and we can have either one of them or two of them. That's where these names come from. In monocots, in addition to having just one cotyledon, the veins in the leaves run parallel, so grasses and palm trees and so on fall into this group. The dicots, in addition to having two cotyledons, they have branched veins. Think of a maple leaf, for instance. There's one structure that made the angiosperms so much more successful than the other plants. One great invention, and that is the flower, which of course is used for reproduction. The gymnosperms, when they release pollen, they have to just dump it into the air and hope that some of it just happens to land on an ovule. But the flower can be used to attract pollinators, things like bees and bats and hummingbirds and so on. They can grab onto pollen, they're usually tricked into doing it, and transport it to another flower of the same species. So it's far more directed, and it means that the plant doesn't need to make nearly as much pollen. So it can save a lot of energy by doing that. Now, what's amazing about flowers is they're made up of modified leaves. There are rows or whorls of modified leaves. Starting at the bottom, we have a whorl made up of sepals. Sepals are leaves that still look mostly like leaves. Above that, we have a whorl of petals. And petals look quite different from leaves. They're usually colorful. They generally have odors, and that's to help attract a pollinator. Now, inward from this, we have two more whorls, two more rows. And these are modified leaves that also produce spores. They're called sporophylls. Don't worry about that, but worry about the names of these next two parts. We have the stamens. The stamens produce the microspores, which develop into pollen grains, which are male gametophytes. And the stamens are made up of an anther. That's where pollen production actually occurs. So that's where meiosis occurs to produce the microspore, which then develops into the male gametophyte. And then they're supported by a filament. And then in the very middle, we have carpels. And sometimes they're all fused together, like you see here. But carpels are highly modified leaves that produce the megaspores that develop into the female gametophyte. And this is where fertilization will ultimately occur. At the base of the carpels, we have a structure known as an ovary, and within that ovary, we have the ovule that contains the female gametophyte and contains the egg cell. Okay, let's take a look at the production of the pollen. In the upper left there, what you're seeing is a section, a cross-section through a flower bud that hasn't opened yet. And one of these structures here is an anther. And then you're seeing that zoomed in down below. So within the anther, we have these four areas here that produce the pollen grains. We have meiosis occurring there first, and then meiosis is followed by a couple of mitotic divisions that give us our male gametophyte. And then here we can see the pollen grains being shed from the anthers. So no doubt you've seen a lily, something like the one that you see up the top here, and these structures here are the anthers, and they're peeling back and they're releasing all of these pollen grains. Let's very quickly have a look at what happens during pollen development in angiosperms. So within the anther, we have diploid cells. Specifically, we have microspore mother cells, but don't worry about the name here. These are the cells that are going to undergo meiosis. Remember that there's two divisions to meiosis, and we end up with 4 haploid cells. And these are the microspores. And I'll show you what happens for just one microspore. So the microspore is not shed yet. Instead, it's retained within the anther, and it undergoes one mitotic division. You can see it's asymmetric. We get one big cell, one little cell. The big cell doesn't divide again, but the little one does, and it divides into 2 sperm cells. And we end up with 2 sperm cells actually inside a bigger cell. And the bigger cell is known as the tube cell. Now this is what's shed from the plant. It's going to be carried by a pollinator to the carpel of another flower. The top of the carpel, it's known as the stigma. That's where the pollen's going to land. And the pollen is very quickly going to grow this tube. The tube cell is going to grow an extension. And this is going to guide the sperm cells to the egg cell that's in an ovule within that carpel. And let's have a quick look at what this looks like under the microscope. We have a microspore mother cell here, so a diploid cell. And here it is in prophase, starting its first division of meiosis. And here in metaphase 1, we can see the chromosomes all lined up in the middle of the cell. And here we're in anaphase 1 and telophase 1 and cytokinesis. That's where the cell actually splits into 2. Here's the second division of meiosis. This is metaphase 2, followed by telophase 2 and cytokinesis. Anyway, we end up with 4 microspores. They're haploid cells. They're going to divide from each other. And then just looking at one of those microspores, it's going to divide again, and then one of those cells is going to divide one more time. And then when this actually finds its way to the female parts of another flower, so this is a mature pollen grain, then the sperm cells, and you can see their nuclei here, are going to be carried down that tube in search of an egg. As you can see, the male gametophyte in the angiosperms is incredibly tiny. It consists of only 3 cells, and 2 of those are sperm cells. Compare that to the moss gametophytes that we started with. They consist of tens or hundreds of thousands of cells. They're the main plant in the life cycle. And this is one of the trends we see in the evolution of plants. The gametophyte generation becomes shorter-lived, and they become physically smaller. The female gametophyte in angiosperms is slightly bigger than the male gametophyte, but not much. It consists of 7 cells, but only 8 nuclei. So we have a great big cell in the middle that has 2 haploid nuclei, and then we have 6 other haploid cells. Incidentally, the female gametophyte is sometimes referred to as the embryo sac. You can consider the female gametophyte and the tissues directly around it as an ovule. Let's take a quick look at how the female gametophyte or embryo sac develops. Again, we start with a diploid cell. This time it's called the megaspore mother cell. And we have our 2 rounds of division of meiosis. And you'd think that we would end up with 4 haploid cells, but actually 3 of them abort. We're left with 1. That's actually not always the case, but this is the simplest case. So we have our 1N megaspore, and it's going to undergo mitosis a few times. It undergoes what's called free nuclear division, and that means that the nuclei divide, but we don't get new cells formed. So we have 1 division, 2 divisions, 3 divisions, and we have this. We have 8 haploid nuclei in one big cell. And now at this point, the cells do start to separate from each other. But 2 of the haploid nuclei get stranded in the great big middle central cell. And here's an actual microscopic image of what we're left with. You can see that we have 6 haploid cells, and one of them is the egg cell. That's the really important one. And then we have that big central cell that has 2 haploid nuclei. So we could say that it's got an N plus N condition. Before we go on to talk about pollination and fertilization, let's just take a few more minutes to talk about the flower. The flower that you see here, the one I showed you before, is referred to as a perfect flower. And what that means is it has both male and female organs. So it has the stamens that produce pollen, and it has the carpels that contain the ovules. But it might surprise you to learn that it is possible to have flowers that are either male or female. What you're seeing here is begonia. And on a begonia plant, you can have female flowers that have carpels but no stamens, and male flowers that have stamens but no carpels. Sometimes we have totally separate male plants and female plants. So there's a bunch of different ways of doing things. Another thing, and I'm just bringing it up because I thought you might find it interesting, is a lot of things that we consider to be one flower are not one flower. They're a whole bunch of tiny flowers. Queen Anne's lace, like you see here, it's a bunch of little flowers. A sunflower is a bunch of very small flowers. Here's a section of a sunflower like the one I just showed you. And you can see that we have lots of little individual flowers. So this is a flower right here, and at the base is the ovary, and that's where the seed is going to develop from a single ovule. Now note that these flowers really don't have much in the way of petals, but the flowers at the ends, these ones here, do. They have massive petals that stick out. So again, when you're looking at a sunflower, it's not one flower, it's an inflorescence which is hundreds of flowers. And the ones at the edges are the ones with the long petals. And once again, always keep in mind that the role of the flower is to encourage pollinators. There are a few species that have given up on that and they use the wind. They usually have rather small, rather bland looking petals, but for the most part, the flower is there to attract pollinators. And those could be bees, they could be moths, they could be hummingbirds, etc. And the flower will have a specific shape, specific smell to attract that specific organism. The flower wants that pollinator to be as specific as possible. Best case scenario, it only visits a certain species. And then pollen won't be wasted and the flower doesn't have to make very much. Now the flower does reward the pollinator, of course. There's a little bit of nectar in the bottom. The markings that you see on a flower are to help guide the pollinator to the nectar. And there's lots of markings we can't see. For instance, there's markings that are only visible with UV light. Insects can see them and we can't. Let's have a look at what happens when a male gametophyte, also known as a pollen grain, meets up with a female gametophyte, also known as an embryo sac. Now the female gametophyte is made up of 7 cells. There's 3 at one end known as antipodals. There's 3 at the other end, and the 2 on the outside are known as synergids. Now you can forget those, but the next 2 are important. In between the 2 synergids, we have the most important cell of the female gametophyte, and that would be the egg cell. And then in the middle of the female gametophyte, we have one large central cell with 2 polar nuclei. Remember, all of these nuclei are haploid. Looking now at the pollen grain, we have 3 cells. We have one big cell, which is the tube cell, and you can see in blue there, that's the tube nucleus. And then embedded within the tube cell, we have 2 sperm cells. The end of a carpel is known as a stigma, and it usually secretes quite a bit of goo. You've probably noticed that on something like a lily. It might actually be dripping goo. The pollen grain lands on this goo and it produces a pollen tube. This thing grows really fast, and it grows through the flesh of the carpel all the way down to the ovary at the bottom and all the way to the ovule that contains a female gametophyte. The pollen tube grows at an incredible rate. In fact, it's thought to be one of the fastest growing cellular structures. Now those synergids, they're not entirely pointless. There was an interesting discovery at the University of Saskatchewan several years ago that suggests the synergids actually produce a chemical. They act kind of like a beacon. They emit this chemical that the pollen tube can follow to find its way to the female gametophyte. Once the pollen tube locates a synergid, it punctures the synergid and dumps the 2 sperm cells into the female gametophyte. One of the sperm cells will fuse with the egg, and that haploid nucleus will end up in the egg. But the other haploid nucleus makes its way to the polar nuclei of the central cell. The haploid sperm nucleus that found its way into the egg fuses with the egg nucleus, and we get a diploid zygote. That makes sense. And the zygote is going to develop into a sporophyte embryo. Now this is the weird part. The other haploid sperm nucleus fuses with the 2 polar nuclei of the central cell. We have 3 haploid cells coming together, so we get a triploid cell, a 3N cell. And this is known as the endosperm nucleus. The zygote divides into 2 cells, starts to form an embryo. That triploid nucleus also divides, but the whole central cell doesn't divide. Instead, this is free nuclear division. Again, that's when the nuclei divide without the cell dividing. The cells divide again, as shown here, and of course they would divide over and over and over again, and we end up with our diploid embryo. We also end up with this tissue that's triploid and known as endosperm. Eventually those nuclei will be divided into their own cells. But this triploid tissue serves as nourishment for the embryo. The process we've just discussed, whereby both sperm cells in the pollen grain are used for something, is referred to as double fertilization. One sperm creates the zygote, one sperm creates the endosperm. And it's very weird. This is not something that happens in any other group of organisms. It's something that's peculiar to the angiosperms. Now that endosperm can be packed around the embryo, and again, its purpose is to help feed the embryo when it first starts to germinate from the seed. If we take a look at a coconut, The husk that you see around the coconut is the fruit. The whole thing would be considered the fruit, even though it's not something you would eat. Inside that, the round cannonball-like thing is the actual seed. And if you crack open the seed, the endosperm is the white bit. It's the flesh of the coconut. It's the part that we eat. What you're seeing here are bean seeds. So imagine you take a bean pod and you split it open and you throw away the pod. The pod developed from the ovary. What you're left with are the seeds, and the seeds developed from the ovules. You can peel the outer coat off of the seed, and then if you take the seeds, they'll split apart very easily into two fleshy bits. If you've ever watched a bean grow, so no doubt you've planted a bean seed at some point, you'll know that the first things that come out of the soil are those fleshy leaf-like structures, and they're called cotyledons. The cotyledons are highly modified leaves that are packed with endosperm. So in many plants, that's where the endosperm goes. It's stored in the cotyledons. Now all the images you see here of these bean seeds, for the most part, have been split apart. So there was actually two cotyledons, so the bean is a dicot. If we look at the split bean seed down the bottom right, you can see I've labeled the cotyledon. That's going to store stuff for nourishment. And down the bottom we have our embryo. We have the root, we have the leaves at the top, and we have the stem in between. A whole little baby plant there, all ready to go. Okay, let's put this all together and review the angiosperm life cycle. So we're starting here with a perfect flower. Again, perfect just refers to the fact that we have both male and female structures. Remember from the diagram on the left that the male structures are called stamens, and they consist of an anther attached to a filament. The female part is known as the carpel. There might just be one, or there might be several. The carpel has three parts. It's got a stigma at the top, which is a sticky surface where the pollen's going to land. It's got a style, which is a long, narrow piece that connects to an ovary at the bottom. The ovary becomes the fruit, and the ovule or ovules inside the ovary become the seeds. So in the anther, we have meiosis occurring to produce microspores that become pollen grains, and then they're picked up by a pollinator. In the ovary, we have ovules that are the site of meiosis to produce megaspores that develop into a female gametophyte. Once the pollen lands on the stigma, it produces a tube that carries two sperm cells all the way down, so through the style, through the ovary, all the way to a female gametophyte in an ovule. Fertilization occurs, and then we have the production of a zygote and also endosperm. The zygote develops into an embryo. The endosperm develops into nourishing tissue, either surrounding the embryo or making up the cotyledons of the embryo. And then when it's a good time for the seed to germinate, the temperature is right, the soil is right, then that embryo starts to develop and give rise to a seedling. And just remember again, there's two steps that are important in this whole cycle. We have pollination, which in this case is when the pollen lands on the stigma. And then we have fertilization. That's when we have the combination of the egg nucleus and also a sperm nucleus. And we have a second kind of like fertilization event where we have the other sperm cell fusing with the polar nuclei. So again, because we have those two combinations with the sperm cells occurring, we call that double fertilization. There's a lot of words that we throw around that aren't quite correct. Words that have specific meanings in biology that people use in strange ways. Fruit is one of those. Vegetable. Let's start with that one. What is a vegetable? It's not a term a biologist would use because a vegetable can be just about any part of a plant. It could be a leaf if we're talking about spinach. It could be a root if we're talking about carrots. It could be a tuber if we're talking about potatoes, or it could be a fruit. Fruit has a very specific meaning in biology. A fruit is a fleshy structure that contains one or more seeds. So you might have something like a peach. There's one seed, and that's because there was one ovule. Or something like an apple. There's several seeds because there were several separate ovules. An apple is a fruit, of course, and it develops from a flower. Each apple came from one flower. So at the base of the flower, there is this swelling called the ovary, and there's also a bit more of a swelling below that called the receptacle. Don't worry too much about that. But mostly the ovary and that receptacle, they swell and grow after fertilization, and that gives rise to the fleshy part of the fruit. And of course, the purpose of this flesh is to entice an animal to eat the fruit and eat the seeds and then disperse the seeds. So when that animal poops it out, hopefully it's traveled a long way from the parent plant, and also it's got some fertilizer. But things like tomatoes, they're fruits. Biologically speaking, they're definitely fruits because they're fleshy and they contain seeds. A cucumber is also a fruit. There is a very specific way that different fruits are named and different seeds are named, and what a nut is and what a berry is. These have very specific meanings in biology. But we don't really have the time to get into all that, but I will point out one really interesting fruit that really isn't one fruit, it's a bunch of fruits mashed together. The pineapple. So the pineapple consists of all of these little sections, and if you take a close look at the little sections, you'll see remnants of some petals there, because each one of these was the ovary at the base of a flower. And all of those ovaries grew together to create this multiple fruit. All right, that wraps it up for the plants, and now I've just got a few concepts. Well, quite a few. I'll go through them quickly. Remember that plants are characterized by the fact that they have apical meristems, alternation of generations, dependent embryos, resistant spores, and multicellular gametangia. The gametangia are the structures on the gametophyte that make the sperm or the egg. The major trend in plant evolution has been the increased dominance of the sporophyte. It's become more important. A decreased reliance on water for fertilization, and the appearance of structures that limit water loss. The diploid sporophyte generation produces haploid spores by meiosis. That's the site of meiosis. The haploid spores develop into haploid gametophytes, and they produce the sperm and egg by mitosis. Quite different from humans and other animals, where we produce our sperm and egg directly by meiosis. A couple quick notes about growth before we go on. Meristems, if you remember, are regions that contain cells that are dividing rapidly by mitosis, and these cells have the potential to become any other type of cell. They're similar to stem cells in animals. Primary growth is the elongation of the plant. And for some plants, that's all they do. They grow longer at the roots and they grow longer at the shoots. Now, the stem in these plants that do nothing else might get a bit wider, but it's just by the cells expanding and getting fatter in size. In some plants, the trunk or stem becomes quite a bit wider, by the deposition of wood, the creation of wood, which is created out of xylem tissue. In these plants, they have a vascular cambium, and that creates something known as secondary growth. So primary growth is elongating, secondary growth is getting wider. Looking at the progression or the trend that we saw, we started out with the mosses. And remember, in the mosses, the gametophyte is dominant. The sporophyte is dominant in all other terrestrial plants. The vascular plants have xylem and phloem. Xylem to conduct water and phloem to conduct sugar. And the veins that you see in a leaf, those are bundles of xylem and phloem. So the vascular plants would be the ferns, the conifers, and the flowering plants. Now I've included the technical names of the larger groups here, but if you just want to know it as ferns, conifers, and flowering plants, that's fine. Xylem, as mentioned, conducts water and dissolved minerals. Phloem conducts sugar. So basically, water has to come up from the roots to get to all the high up tissues, the branches and leaves and so on, if we're talking about a tree. And phloem conducts sugar down to the roots because they're underground and they're not photosynthetic, so they need to have food provided to them. In the spring, that sugar that went down to the roots over the winter comes back up, and that's when we can tap into it and make maple syrup or birch syrup, for instance. Plants do have distinct tissues, although they don't have as many as us. And we haven't really talked about them, but there's about 15 or so distinct tissues. Xylem and phloem are the only ones that we've mentioned. And the tissues make up distinct organs. I didn't really talk about that, but we can consider the leaves, the stems, etc. separate organs, just like the organs in our body, and the flower would be considered an organ. The gymnosperms and angiosperms, so the conifers and their relatives, and the flowering plants have continued the trend of gametophyte reduction, and they've taken it to extremes. The seed was another addition that allowed for the dispersal of these plants. In both gymnosperms and angiosperms, the sperm cells are carried to the egg by a pollen tube. In gymnosperms, the seed is naked, it's not surrounded by anything fleshy, and in the angiosperms, the seed is often enclosed within fleshy tissue, and that is known as the fruit. So the entire thing, including the seeds, is known as the fruit, and the fruit is derived from the ovary, and sometimes some other structures that we won't get into. Gymnosperm embryos are nourished by haploid tissue that came directly from the gametophyte. But remember, in angiosperms, the flowering plants, this is not the case. The embryo here is nourished by a triploid tissue called endosperm, and this is one of the results of double fertilization. Endosperm can be stored around the embryo or as part of the embryo. So endosperm can make up modified leaves of the embryo known as cotyledons. And this fuel is going to help that embryo sprout into a seedling, and it's going to feed it until it can start collecting its own energy and making its own food through photosynthesis. The flower is used to attract animal pollinators, and definitely this is responsible for the success of the angiosperms. It allows them to be very frugal with their pollen. They don't have to make as much of it because they can coerce a pollinator to carry their pollen to other flowers of the same species. Sometimes they're offered a reward like nectar, or sometimes they even get to eat a tiny bit of the pollen, but other times it's downright trickery. And I'll leave you with this one example here. This is a wasp that is attracted to this odd-looking flower. It actually thinks that flower is a female wasp. This is a male. It not only kind of looks like a wasp if you squint, it also smells like a wasp. That's the most important part. This flower smells like a female wasp, and this male wasp will attempt to mate with it. And it will waste a lot of time, and it won't get anywhere, but it will get covered in pollen, and then it's going to fly off and be tricked by another one of these flowers, attempt to mate with it, and it's not getting anything accomplished, but the flower is. The flower gets to have sex, and the wasp doesn't. And to end off, as always, we have some important terminology, the stuff you should focus on for your upcoming final exam. These are terms that relate to the evolution of terrestrial plants in general. And finally, some terms that apply specifically to seed plants. So that's it for the plants. That was a pretty quick tour of their biology. Hopefully you found it interesting and you now realize that plants are maybe weirder, maybe kinkier than you thought. They do some weird stuff when it comes to sex and reproduction. Next, we're going to be talking about animals. And of course, that's the group that includes us. So stay tuned.